There's nothing like a bit of face-melting, brain-busting, pants-wetting, 24 frames per second action blast insanery to make general audiences say, "Whoa, the animation in this show is truly superior quality." But at the end of the day, the purpose of animation is to tell a story, and sometimes the emotional pinnacle of a story is defeating the sworn enemy with your mega ultra shadow blast upside down monsoon punch, but sometimes it's taking a spoonful of soup and realizing that you were probably an accidental cannibal back in your Steven Universe phase, then taking another spoonful of a slightly different soup and realizing that actually you weren't. And admittedly, top-notch head rotation and soup-based revelations like this are a bit harder to talk about than big man move arm fast, small man head explode.
Your head explode.
But Dungeon episode 23 proves that those scenes can make just as good use of animators' literal blood, sweat, and tears. Because while there is some good action for us to touch on towards the end, where this episode really shines is in the subtler character acting, particularly from one mysterious animator whose work has been elevating subtler moments throughout the show, and I've actually pointed out a good handful of times, but hasn't got as much direct attention in these videos as they maybe should have. So let's break down the animation and storytelling while comparing it a little to the source material along the way. Here we are at the penultimate episode of what we can only hope and semi-assume is season 1 of 2 of Dungeon Meshi, and an extra long one at that, with storyboards and episode direction both from Yuichiro Shimodaira, which combines one of the darkest chapters from the manga, 49, with one of the silliest, 50. And as a symptom of being close to the end of the season, there's a bit of a strange feeling to the story beats that have been adapted in this and the previous episode. We'll touch on it a little bit at the end. As I mentioned with the elves, one of mangaka Ryoko Kui's strongest talents is character design and her ability to create sets of wildly different characters with unique silhouettes and vibes while still sharing the common features that make them recognizable as their particular fantasy race. And the same is true of this group of dwarves. Well, this guy's a gnome. But still, when in doubt, just use the oldest trick in the cartoon book, Circle Man and Square Man. Senshi only found out last episode that Chilchuk is not actually a child, despite him having told them earlier that he's 29, but that makes sense given that this is what Senshi looked like at 36. Even at this early stage of the episode, there's already a lot of attention being paid to character moments like this close-up here, probably by key animator Yoshitaka Amano, who did the cut immediately before it, where Senshi eases into this position really smoothly across 9 frames. A movement that could have easily been accomplished with just 4 or 5. But this narrated recollection is all about his subjective experience, so there's nothing more important to this scene than the change in his expression and the way his shoulders drop as he looks up at Gillen.
According to geologists at UC Berkeley, you should eat at least 1 small rock per day.
This cut is a very literal adaptation of this panel, and if I'm honest, I think it ends up looking way too cartoonish for such a tragic moment when put to animation. There are so many details about why Senshi is the way he is packed into this flashback, from literal ones like Gillen's dented helmet, the weirdly symmetrical walk made of 2 shields, and the footgear from Brigand, to character traits like his obsession with learning all he can about the dungeon and its monsters and keeping the youngsters well fed. He clearly saw Gillen as a role model. Also, you may have noticed that the horse they ate was named Anne, just like his friend the Kelpie, which retroactively brings a whole new meaning to the scene where they ate her too. This poor guy. There is one small bit omitted, which is not at all vital to the story, but hints at the origin of Senshi's philosophy of coexistence with monsters as he learns about the orcs that are beginning to set up shop in the dungeon.
Well, we got that, Griffin. You want to eat it?
I think we all know Laios' real motivation here. He just wants to eat that thing. I do, however, miss Ryoko Kui's faraway kitty design. There's a little more deductive reasoning here in the books, but it's not necessary. Chilchuk basically explains the implied worst-case version of Senshi's story, but I think it's pretty easy to put together on your own. For once, this is a cut I totally agree with. I love the way Laios gets distracted, prances away, and kneels down on his toes to study the changeling mushrooms in the middle of cooking a meal. There's been a lot of animated boiling water in this show, and the way it's animated almost always conveys something about the dish and the scene that surrounds it. In this cut, the animator has gone for a more realistic approach than usual, without as many of the big round bubbles. There's much more emphasis on the reflections in the surface of the water rapidly moving and distorting. And this goes for the soup here, the boiling water, and the soup in Senshi's memory. They're all notably missing the extra bright highlights and bloom effects. It looks dull and tasteless. It is just meat boiled in water with no seasoning after all. And this cut improves on these 2 panels by putting them in motion and takes us on a journey through Senshi's progression of emotions: shock, worry, realization, and finally anguish as his brow furls and the skin bunches up around the bridge of his nose, and his head tilts downward, casting a shadow between his eyes. He cycles through them all in this one display of character acting, and all it takes is one extreme close-up shot that only shows you exactly what you need to know. But the real star of the show that I teased in the intro comes a little later with the second soup taste test of the episode, and for anyone just tuning in live to the middle of this YouTube video without having watched the previous 22 episodes, yes, this show is very good and not boring at all, you just have to trust me on that. This bit is done by the mysterious animator just credited as Haruki, also known as Haruki Sakamoto, another relatively young talent like Ichigo Kano, and in fact the two apparently studied together and collaborated on this project as students. And by the way, I'll try to remember to link my sources for all this stuff in the description, thanks to the person who let me know that I forgot last time. Haruki trained at Kyoto Animation, and you can see the influence plainly in his style, which, much unlike the flashy, snappy, grandiose style of his friend Ichigo Kano, is characterized by very smooth motion and attention to realistic detail and nuances that might otherwise have gone overlooked. And his work has been present throughout the show, holding down subtle movements and character moments like Fallen leading Marcel by the hand into the tiny dungeon, and the Kelpie emerging from the water, Laios lecturing Toshiro about the importance of nutrition, and even that little bit of Griffin animation that I pointed out last episode. But now that one of his cuts is finally the most important moment in the episode, it's finally time for the full spotlight on his work and distinctive style. Even starting from the anticipation, and here I mean that in the normal sense, not the technical animation sense, the attention to detail is on point, from the incredibly consistent shapes of the spoon and bowl which each rotate toward and away from the camera, to the subtle rotation of his head, not only when he actually lifts the spoon to his mouth, but also even earlier as he brings the bowl up to his face, to the little half blink as his expression goes from worry to determination. There's so much nuance in this series of facial expressions that if this was live action, I would be amazed at this actor's ability to convey so much with this performance. And that's not even to mention the actual realization, the shock that spreads across his face before gradually transforming into the overwhelming feeling of relief that forms creases in his brow and brings him to tears. And in the pièce de résistance, the final reveal, the tears run freely, and Haruki and the effects department bring a KyoAni flair that makes the tears into something beautiful, the culmination of a lifetime of worry, finally able to be released. The highlights in Senshi's eyes twirl around in this unrealistic but pleasingly stylized way, hinting at the welling of tears over his eyeballs. Also, they form little smiley faces in some of these frames. Kinda reminds me of the Windows loading screen. Did that ruin the moment? Sorry. And unlike the sweat beads from a second earlier, these tears and the highlights in his eyes are all now embellished with the shiny bloom effect. Senshi has generally been depicted as the most cartoony of the bunch, a stoic but goofy little teddy bear who's often silent and almost always has his entire face obscured. So it's all the more powerful to see his face with so much detail and expression in this cathartic, emotional moment that finally solidifies this group as his new family. You can even see his mouth move when he talks. And this next bit makes the connection between Laios' crew and Senshi's old treasure hunting crew even more direct and literal with this crossfade transition that even places his face in approximately the same position in the frame. This connection is obviously there in the manga panels, but it's made much stronger in the show, and after seeing this version, I actually think the manga could have benefited from two identical panels instead of the one vertical and one horizontal. And as one more little flourish to cap off the mini arc, the animators take this panel and turn it into another full head turn as he faces the group to reaffirm his membership and to warn them about the dangers of desire and the way the dungeon reacts to it. That right there is something to remember for season 2. Whew, that was heavy. But luckily one of these... But luckily, one of the silliest bits is here to lift the mood, and after recounting that harrowing tale, Senshi gets a break to just sort of sit around and look all sexy in a very different way than he normally does. I really wish they had kept this in the show. I love the race swap arc, and it prompted Kui to make this whole chart of all the characters in all the different races, which I would be remiss not to show here, and also the chapter cover, which is a recreation of the cover of the first volume. There are so many great little differences in things like their hair textures, where Laios' hair used to be made of smaller angular strands, it's now much more wavy and rounded, while Chilchuk's is much straighter than it used to be. And there are even slight changes in the characters' personalities, like how it's been implied that Halffoot's heightened senses can overload their brains and cause them a lot of anxiety, which is why they can seem so frantic all the time. And that, mixed with Marcel's good old regular style neuroticism, means that she's an absolute mess. Meanwhile, Chilchuk, blanketed in the muffling cocoon of dull tall man senses, weaknesses, is now ruled completely by the middle-aged absent dad energy that used to be balanced out by that frantic energy. Also, he's like insanely tall for a half-foot, so as a tall man, he's even taller than Laios. And Senshi is just so unbelievably hairy that even as an elf, he has a goatee. Come to think of it, why doesn't Laios have a beard? I guess he's just exceedingly hairless. This bit is pretty significantly compressed to make room for the almost 16 full minutes of Senshi stuff, and there's a piece cut where Laios gets to fantasize about being turned into a troll or a kobold, among a few other things. Again, I do recommend you read it, and I get comments almost every week saying, I'm surprised you didn't mention X thing, and there will always be bits that I don't have time to get to, so let me know what I missed this time in the comments. Everything's going great until they realize that everyone's natural abilities don't totally match up with their acquired skill sets anymore, and this would have been my favorite cut from the episode if it weren't for, you know, all the weepy stuff earlier. The big jumps between frames and opposing motion in opposite directions as Chilchuk smashes into the ground and bounces 3 times before settling makes this feel sloppy and unceremonious, and it's a terrific interpretation of this panel from the manga. Let's just watch it a few times to make sure you get why it's so great. He's fine. And this cut, by contrast, looks so smooth, not just because it's animated on ones, but also because of its super clean easing and use of smear frames. And if you look closely, the sword actually bends a tiny bit right before each swing, almost like it's easing into the smear frame. Humans are often positioned in fantasy and sci-fi as the vanilla option with no particular strengths or weaknesses, but one major strength that often goes overlooked, including by Laios, who doesn't particularly like being a human, is our insane stamina when compared to other animals. But leave it to Ryoko Kui to factor that type of thing in. I love that you can see exactly which dumplings Izutsumi made, and that she only made like 7 of them. With the Griffin and Changelings, each 2-chapter pairs, it's a little strange to have the Griffin spread across 2 episodes and the Changeling issue still yet to be resolved until the first half of next episode, but it's a necessary scheduling choice with only a few points that would really make a good end to the season and a couple very dialogue-heavy chapters that need to be paired with a more action-focused chapter for balance. And... whoa, no ED? No credits? They must have been really pushing the limits on episode runtime this week in order to really do the Senshi stuff justice. So I guess I'm just trapped in this black void then until next week. Well, thank you to all my supporters on Patreon, whose names will hopefully be able to guide me out of this abyss. Lea Pico, Mamori, Scrubbin, Katie L, Siege Weasel, Retrohime, Serial Isle, Nutaf, Patrick Davison, Arborix, Lisette MT, Ginger June, Jun, Dr. Yola McSwag, Grav G, Squid Goo, Achu, Austin and Shoji, Julian Francisco, Joe, Daku, Alex Cervantes, and Jen Stalins, as well as all the other names you're seeing on the screen right now. And thank you for watching.